Hey, this is Ramon, channel's Alpha 4. That's Alpha 4 IV. And this is part of my biblical series of my Bible study. And this is chapter 7, the flood. And chapter 7 is, it introduces the idea of clean and unclean animals. Something that won't be seen in some versions until we get to Mount Sinai. So it's interesting that in some versions, and specifically the English versions, you're going to see those texts combined all together, and you're going to see basically the idea of clean and unclean animals from the, I believe it's the priestly text, all the way through. While in the J text, you won't see it until later. So, but this is also, I think the reason for that is also an editorial decision. Basically, it's to make sense of how Noah ate and how he sacrificed. If you only had two of each kind, well then, once you sacrifice, there goes a whole species. So that's something there. Just a little note, editorial note. Noah and his family enter twice, which is something I missed. I had to read through the notes. I believe it was either the Oxford NAB or the Oxford NRSV. Might have even been a biblical dictionary or biblical concordance, maybe the New American. But they enter twice, and that further shows that there are two narratives here. So the first narrative is that the flood is caused by rain. The second narrative is that the flood is caused by the upper and lower oceans meeting. And I've even read some versions, and specifically noted and heard people talk about some versions where God actually opens up the dome of the sky and lets the outside water rush in. So that version I'm not familiar with at all, but that's, I've heard that. Okay. They land in Armenia, which interesting. I didn't know that. I figured they would have stayed somewhere around Israel, but yeah. And this is and at the end of the story, once they land, once the flood is done and water recedes, and you get the directive that humankind is responsible for Earth, and that you kind of get a restatement of how things are supposed to work. The way that you get there is through three birds, and there's a lot of Trinity references and other stuff like that. But what an interesting literary reference here is to the Epic of Gilgamesh. So in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it goes the first a sparrow fails, then a dove fails, and then finally a raven succeeds. In the biblical version, it's in verse. So you have the raven failing, you have the sparrow or the first dove failing, and then you have the final dove, the dove of peace, succeeding and finding an olive branch. So you have a literal inversion of the previous story. So it's really interesting to see that inversion there. So that's the flood. Let's talk about the flood for just a second. Was there a flood? Depends what you mean. There are flood stories all throughout this region, and there is no doubt that the Mesopotamian area flooded between the Euphrates and the Tigris. Definitely flooded. Interesting enough, just environmentally, the Sahara Desert used to be green. Okay? It used to not be a desert. It used to be a plain. The environment changes. The Nile used to flood so bad that it would drown out all the villages, and it would be a destructive force to where you couldn't settle next to the river. In Greece, there are stories of the Great Deluge. And here, basically, either from the ice caps or from some type of expanse or typhoon or something in the Mediterranean, the water levels were higher up and parts of Greece were underwater. Any island nation is going to have flood stories, and that we can go all the way to Asia and all that for that. But let's stay in the Mediterranean. So, were there floods, multiple, at different time periods? Yes. And if you were an ancient person, and I want you to think about this, if you've seen video footage of Katrina, or you've seen video footage of what's going on in Houston with the flooding, a flood covers an entire city, an entire area. Okay, now imagine an entire valley, an entire area of waterways, and they're just drowned out. If you are an ancient person with no reference for the greater reality, for the size of the earth, and everything that you know, everything that you can see is flooded, then to you, from your perspective, the entire world is flooded. And let's not forget that metaphors exist even at this time. So just like how an artist might say, my entire world flooded, or the whole world collapsed, or, the stars themselves disappeared from the sky. Well, that's just a metaphor, but it's a strong and powerful metaphor. So it is totally possible that these are multiple floods in multiple locations. And then if you think about the fact that most of the Genesis, especially the older Genesis stories, are post-exile stories, these stories would have been influenced by the Mesopotamian stories, and the Mesopotamian libraries had records of the other flood stories from other cultures. Not from every culture, obviously, but from Egypt and whatever Mycenaean or Minoan culture might have existed. Anywhere that you can find cuneiform, you can find possibly some reference to something flooding. So I would argue that yes, their whole world did flood, and when your whole world is a small set of nations, then to you the entire world was covered in water. So is there truth there? Yes. Were there floods, plural? Yes. Was there one single world flood that covered the entire world? Probably not. At one point the earth was completely covered in water. I don't think any life existed at that time, or if it did, it definitely wasn't human. Is it possible to have genetic memories of something? I don't know. That's speculation at best. But is it possible for these cultures to have a oral tradition of flood stories to warn people that this area might flood, but to give their children hope and to give their citizens hope that it will not be the worst flood ever, because the worst flood ever already happened, and God has guaranteed that that will not happen again. So someone or something will survive. And here's how they survived it last time. It's a plan of action, and it's a plan of hope, and it's a seed of hope. And I think that's what that story is. I think it's more than just explaining a story in the context of a biblical idea. I think it's a message to the people. And I think this is a message to us to be aware of floods in our own lives, both literal and metaphorical. Anyway, peace, like and subscribe. Talk to you in the next one.